Hello, Time Wizard here once again. The last video that I did was how to make a mold of a scratch-built building in this particular case, it was for a Flames of War game system. So it was a 15mm building, and I used a two-part mix of RTV, room temperature vulcanizing silicone, and I ended up with this mold here. Of course, once you have a mold, the next thing that you're going to do is you're going to cast pieces of that mold in order to make the actual parts for the building. Now, with two walls and two gable ends, it really wouldn't be much of a building, so I don't have to bore you with the details of how I made a second mold. The second mold was other walls and then some pieces that will hold the walls together. I also picked up, now whether the technique I'm going to show you for casting is the same whether it's a mold that you made or whether it's a commercial mold that you got. This is a mold that I had that I've perked up from a company called Hearst Arts. He makes very, very nice molds. I've never had a problem with them. They work very, very well. And the technique that I'm going to show you is how to cast these molds using a hydrocal type substance. What I'm using is something that we get over here in the United States called Merlin's Magic, which is a hydrocal based casting material. It comes in a nice gray color, and you can see that it's just very powdery, just like plaster or hydrocal that you would get anywhere else. Now, casting molds is pretty messy, so what I do is I have this old plastic tray that I found, and I'll take the molds and place the molds in this tray. This way, once I pour in the hydrocal, I can scrape off the top of the molds, and I'll show you why and explain why later, and let them sit, and I don't get a mess all over the desk. So, next thing we have to do is we have to mix up the hydrocal. So I put this off to the side. Now, mixing up the hydrocal, I was lucky enough to find one of these things online. This is a bucket, a rubber bucket like the dentists use in the dentist office to mix up their material. It's fairly easy to clean. It does a great job mixing up whatever quantity of hydrocal you want, and this is what I use when I mix up mine. So the first thing you do is, I've seen different videos on this, I've seen different tips on this and techniques on this, and I've seen a lot of guys that put the powder into the container and dump the liquid in and then start mixing it up. That's really not the way to do it. That's doing it exactly backwards. The best way to do it is to put the liquid in first and then add the powder. The reason for this is that it helps the powder to hydrate, to get into the water more quickly and more completely, and you don't have to do a lot of stirring and a lot of mixing in order to get the powder and the liquid incorporated completely. The more you mix it, the more likely you are to get bubbles. And in casting and mold making, bubbles are the enemy. You want to eliminate or avoid the bubbles as much as you can. Now, for the three molds that I'm doing, I find that I need roughly around 3 ounces of water. So I pour the 3 ounces of water in, and then I start adding the powder into the mixing container. And I'm just going to take a plastic spoon. I'm just going to add it in kind of a spoon at a time. Now, you don't have to be tremendously slow putting this in. You can put it in at a pretty good pace, but you don't want to just take it and dump it in there. You want to kind of sprinkle it over the top, sprinkle it in there as I'm doing. And you can see that there are bubbles already breaking on the surface. And that's just air bubbles coming out of the material as I put it in there. So I'm going to keep adding the powder in there. Now, I didn't measure out the powder. I didn't weigh it. I didn't make a measurement on it, because as you're adding it in, what you're going to find is that you'll get to a point where you can start to see it starting to happen now, where the hydrocal, the plaster, is actually almost sitting on top of the water. What that means is that you've got a good amount in there, and you're getting close to the point where you have enough of the hydrocal or the plaster mixed up. I just need a little bit more. The reason that I like doing it this way is because it doesn't matter how much water you start with, whether you start with 1 ounce, 2 ounces, 3 ounces, you're going to be adding the hydrocal in the same way. You don't have to worry about measuring the amount of hydrocal that you're going to put in. You're always going to come up with the same kind of an end point with it when you know that you put enough in. Now, as you can see here, I've got more hydrocal in there, and you now see where you can actually see the dry powder is sitting on top, and you can see where the water is slowly kind of hydrating it and turning it from that light gray to the dark gray. So I have almost enough in there. And you can see that there's some spots around the outside where there's more liquid than anything else, so I'm going to just put a little bit more in. And you see the way it's cracking there? That means that that's just about right. I've got all the hydrocal in there that I want to at this point. The consistency is going to be fairly good. It's going to be about the consistency of like heavy cream when I get done with it. Now once all of the hydrocal has been absorbed, you can see there's just a little bit left there. Now I'm going to start stirring it. And again, I want to stir it completely. You can see that there's a little pigmentation in there. This Merlin's Magic is actually pretty good. It's got a pigment mixed in with it, and it's also got its own mold release agent mixed in with it, which makes it really, really good for getting the cast pieces out of the mold without having to use any other products in there. So again, I'm going to mix it together, and you can see that there's a fair number of bubbles that are coming up to the top. But you don't have to worry about saying, oh, I've only got like 30 seconds to mix this stuff up. You have a fair amount of time to work with it. It doesn't set up that quickly. So again, I'm just going to keep working it around, get it mixed in there nice. And again, you'll notice that I'm mixing it together fairly slowly, because again, I don't want to put any bubbles in. I want to take any bubbles that might be in there out. And another way to do that is once you get to that point, you can just kind of tap the side of your mixing container. And you don't have to use something like this. You could use just about anything to mix it up. You could use a plastic container, you could use a plastic cup, but you're going to be doing the same thing. You're going to be just tapping the side of it like this and try to get those air bubbles to come up to the top. Now also, you'll see over here that I've got a little powder left on the side. Make sure that you have any powder that's left in here mixed into the mixture. Get it all nice and mixed in there well. And that's pretty good. So we'll let a few more air bubbles come up, and I'm just going to let that sit and rest for a couple of seconds. Let a few more air bubbles come up, and now I can bring the molds back in, and we're going to be about ready to pour. Okay, so it's mixed up very well. Most of the air bubbles are gone. Now you notice that the bubbles are kind of on the top. So one thing that I found that's helpful is if you dip the spoon to the bottom of the mixture and you bring it up, you can see how most of the air bubbles disappear. So what I do is I'll take it a spoonful by spoonful and get some of that mixture from the bottom where most of the air bubbles are gone. And I'll use that to start filling in the molds, because now I'm minimizing the air bubbles that might be next to the finished portion or the finished surface of the mold. Because remember, this is actually being done upside down. What you're seeing there is what's going to be the good side, the finished good side of the cast. So again, I'll just pour a little bit into the molds just to get it started in there. I'll do the same thing with the second mold. And again, I'm not looking to fill it up completely at this point. I'm just trying to get that outer surface or the face of the casting filled with that hydrocal mixture. And again, when you're mixing the hydrocal, you want to mix it well, but you don't want to overmix it. Now, another thing to mention is that when you first make the mold, or when you buy a commercial mold, the first thing that you want to do with it is you want to clean it. And when you clean it, the best thing to clean it with is something that most modelers are familiar with. It's called wet water. And that's merely water that's been mixed together with a wetting agent. Over here in the United States, I found this product, Jet Dry, that's used for dishwashers. That works very, very well as a wetting agent for the water. And that all you do is you just make up a mixture of that. You pour that into the molds before the first cast. Mix it in real good, or actually push it in real good with a brush, and then give the mold a little rinse with clear water, and you're ready to pour. And what that does is it helps to minimize the little air bubbles that you might get into the mold. Alright, so now I've got all the molds pretty much done. And again, I've got 2 molds here for the building walls and the end gables, and 1 mold here for the roof pieces. So with 3 ounces of water and the hydrocal, I'm going to have an entire building. Now I'm just going to take and I'm going to pour more hydrocal in there, and I'm going to make sure that I fill all of these areas. And you want the level of the hydrocal to come up just kind of over the top of the top surface. It doesn't have to be completely poured over the top where it's running all over the place. We just want it to be over the top. It's kind of like if you could imagine, you know, a pillow laying down where the top of the pillow is just puffed up a little bit. That's about how you want it. And there's just a little bit left in there. You can see that it's actually, now it's not setting up, but it does settle down. So we've got just a little bit more that is settled down in there, and I can just drip a little bit into whatever areas or whatever pieces I think need a little bit more in there. And don't worry if every single corner isn't filled yet, because the next thing that we're going to do is we're just going to give this all a pretty good wrap, and that's going to help. That's going to do 2 things. It's going to help the hydrocal to settle into the corners, and it's also going to help to bring up some air bubbles. So I'm just going to start giving this a good tap. If you notice, like right over here, you can see that the hydrocal hasn't really completely filled in that corner of that mold, but I'll give it a few taps back and forth, and it'll get in there and it'll fill that corner. And also you can see that there's some air bubbles coming up to the top. That's where we want them. We want them to come up to the top of the mold. So you've got better things to do than sit here and watch me tap this for a while. Understand that I am going to continue to tap it for a little bit, get those air bubbles up, and then I'll be back to show you the next step. Be right back. Okay, it's been about 5 minutes, 7 minutes or so. The next step that we're going to do is we're going to scrape the molds. Now you can use a plastic roller, any kind of a plastic straight edge. I use a paint scraper. This is a plastic paint scraper I picked up at a local home store. Scraping the top of the molds, you want the consistency of the hydrocal to be about, you know, like toothpaste, maybe a little thicker than toothpaste. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hold this at about a 45-degree angle, and I'm just going to scrape it right across the top of the mold. Bring it over a couple of times, and that's it. That's now scraped right across the top of the mold. Now this is going to do a couple of things for you. The first thing it's going to do is it's going to actually make sure that every single spot of the mold is filled in properly. The second thing that it's going to do is it's going to make this surface of the casting perfectly flat, perfectly smooth, which is going to help when you start doing your assembly of whatever you're casting. In this case, it's going to be walls, and it's going to be a roof for a small building. So it'll save a lot of time just trying to sand this thing. Now don't worry if it's a little bit too thick. Again, you want to do this before it sets up completely. But just take a couple of nice light swipes across the top and make sure that you have the top of the casting, the top of the mold, nice and cleared out. Take one last swipe right down this way. And if there's 1 or 2 spots that aren't exactly perfect, don't get all stressed over it, because you can get rid of them with a little bit of sanding later on. That takes care of that one. Now just 1 more to go. And that's it. And that's the last mold scraped off clean. Get a little bit more back on this one. Just clean that up a little bit. And now we're just going to let them sit and let the hydrocal set. And we'll be back when that's done. Okay, it's now been about 30 minutes. The hydrocal seems to have set up pretty well. Let's find out. This is the mixing tub that I used, and if I just kind of squeeze it around a little bit, you can see that the hydrocal is broken up in there real nice. The other way that I test to make sure that the hydrocal is set up and is ready to be unmolded is I just take a hobby knife, take the back of it, and I'll give it a good tap on the back. It's also, you could use the the scrapings where it was scraped off. And when it's hard like that, and it sounds like that, and it doesn't make any kind of an impression or a mark in that casting, it's ready to unmold. As far as unmolding, it's always better to wait a little bit longer than to try to take it out earlier, because it'll end up breaking on you. Another important thing that I want to mention now before I unmold these things is all of this off, the scraping off that you do and the hydrocal that you mix up. Do not be in a rush to wash your tools and to wash out your bucket or your mixing tub, whatever you're using. The reason being is if you pour the stuff down the sink and it doesn't flush completely out, what it will do is it'll set up in your sink just like it did here. Eventually, right on the bottom of the trap, the S-trap on the sink, you'll end up with a big mass of hydrocal in there that you won't be able to clean out. So let's see how our castings came out. You can see that we've got, this is where the pieces that were scraped off. You can see how nicely set up they are. And here we go with our first wall section, and that's out of the mold right there. Looks pretty good. Our second wall section, and our two gable ends. And we've got our other wall pieces here. And you can see how nicely that hydrocal has set up. They're unmolding very nicely. We're not breaking any pieces up. Even these long pieces, which might have a tendency to crack if it's not set up properly, are coming out fine. And there's a last small wall section. And then our roof pieces. These are pieces for a slate roof that they're going to be joined together. I've got a few air bubbles in here, but nothing that can't be taken care of. I'll just fill them in a little bit later. This is a difficult mold. I do seem to get more air bubbles in here than anything else. But again, nothing that I can't repair a bit. Two more roof sections here that'll come out. And some other pieces for the gable end. And I'll just throw away the rest of that stuff in a little bit. Remember where I said that sometimes you'll get little pieces around the side. If you can see on this gable end, I've got some pieces over here, kind of like an overflow. I found in my home goods store, this is a rasp that's used. It's used for trimming down wallboard. It's also used for trimming off wood. Gypsum wallboard is, again, a plaster product. This has, it's almost like a cheese grater type material, very sharp. This one isn't that sharp anymore because I've been using it so much. But it does a great job taking these little pieces off. All you do is just take a couple of quick passes with it. And you can see that the side of the hydrocal has now been smoothed out nicely. Same thing over here, just another couple of light hits with it. And there you go. The piece is now all cleaned up. What's nice about it is that, unlike sandpaper, it doesn't get all clogged up. The hydrocal that you scrape off comes out of it really nice. Keeps it from, making a big mess. I know with sandpaper, it gets all clogged up, you end up throwing it away. So, there you have it. Very quick and easy on how to cast up your pieces. And if you do model for wargaming, these pieces here that you have left over, don't throw them away, because you can just take these and you can break them up, and they can become a nice rubble pile in some of the scenery pieces that you do if you're building up a ruin or a building with broken pieces around it. So there you have it. And at the end of this video, I want to remember to put a link to our site, Age of Strife. And I hope you enjoyed watching this, and I hope it helps you out with your future casting. Sorry, thought I was done. Just a little postscript. Now that the pieces have been cast up, they're set, they're hard, but they're still fairly wet. Don't try to assemble them right away. They have to sit and dry at least overnight. You can either put them on newspapers to let them dry, or you can just use a rack. I use a wire rack to set them on. Hurst, his site, recommends putting them into a dehydrator and using a dehydrator overnight. Whatever you want to use it. Just make sure that you leave them overnight and let them dry before you start trying to put glue on them and assembling them. And that is it.